pray with me? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Last week, we began a conversation about first things, about the first things that the first church did on its first day. The story of the birth of the church is recorded in the second chapter of Acts. And from the very beginning, from the very first day, there were a number of things. In fact, there were 4 fixtures of that first church that we continue to practice, that are part of our rhythms to this day. Acts chapter 2, verse 42 tells us that that first church, in those first days, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Well, today I want to talk about the most dangerous of those 4 practices, and it is the final one. I want to skip ahead to the last of the 4 fixtures of the first church and talk about prayer, because prayer is a dangerous thing. Now, I didn't know how dangerous prayer was until 1988. In 1988, I was a young pastor, and I'll go ahead and tell you I was 32 years old, so you can do the math. 30 years, it's not that hard. I was 32, I was a young pastor at a small church in Richardson, Texas, and things were not going well. We were a young family, we were trying to make ends meet, and I found a great deal of refuge. I found a shelter in the practice of prayer. And I figured if anything was worth doing, it was worth doing to excess. So for a number of years, I had a prayer practice where I would meet people in my office 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, at 6 a.m. every day, and at 6 p.m. every day. For a number of years, I met with folks for an hour of prayer at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. In fact, every Sunday during both of our worship services at that little church, we had a room behind the sanctuary where I recruited a group of people to actually be in prayer while we were in worship. And so I was practicing prayer with great intensity, you could say with great desperation at that time. Well, during that time, there was a young man in our church, his name was Bill, and he worked for a guy named Josh McDowell. Do any of you know who Josh McDowell is? Josh is one of the preeminent youth evangelists for the last 50 years or so. And Josh, in the late 1960s, published a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It is a presuppositional apologetic defense of the Christian faith. It sold tens of millions of copies. In the 1970s, he published a follow-up book to that called More Than a Carpenter. These 2 works have literally been published in over 130 languages and have sold over tens of millions of copies. Well, Bill was part of Josh McDowell's ministry staff. He had a staff of about 30 or 40 people that helped him with research and helped him with his travel and helped him with his publications and all of the things that his large ministry was responsible for. And Bill was Josh's Google. He was the chairman, he was the director of his research department. And so Bill, as a member of our church, was aware of my sort of practice of prayer. And he said one day in 1988, he said, would you come to talk to the Josh McDowell team at our weekly staff meeting / Bible study, talk to us about prayer? And I thought, yeah, I'd be glad to do that. At that very same time, Josh McDowell and his team were putting together a campaign that they came to call the Why Wait campaign. It was a campaign that was addressing the issues of premarital sex and advocating for premarital sexual abstinence. And Josh published a book called Why Wait? So this team of young Campus Crusade missionaries and Josh McDowell were focused on this sort of argument to encourage young people outside of marriage to abstain from sexual relationships. And I had a brilliant idea. I thought that it would be a perfect thing for me to go to this staff meeting and talk to them about prayer as intercourse with God. Let's just say it didn't go over well. Because I just barged in there, and in my mind, the notion of human sexuality and sexual relationships and prayer went perfectly together. The ideas of intimacy and vulnerability and nakedness were part of the experience of having an intimate relationship with God. And I was clever enough to realize that the word intercourse, in its original meaning, had nothing to do with physical connection. It was a verbal connection. When you had a dialogue, you had intercourse with someone. And so I thought I was outrageously clever, and they thought I was a colossal idiot and heretic at the same time. And the more I talked and the more I unpacked this metaphor there with the team who were young, just out of college, missionaries with Crusade, the more I realized how dangerous prayer was. Well, prayer wasn't actually dangerous in that moment. I was dangerous in that moment. I was an idiot in that moment. But I realized how dangerous and controversial prayer is, how easy it is for us to mishandle it, for us to misunderstand it, to walk away from prayer with the notion that we can somehow manipulate or manage God, to think that prayer is something that we really understand, when the more we understand about prayer, the more we realize we understand nothing about it. Prayer is full of contradictions and paradoxes and mysteries, and it is a dangerous thing. But the early church found a refuge in it. They found shelter together in prayer. The word that occurs in Acts chapter 2:42, which is translated prayer, is the word proskunuo. Proskunuo is a word that etymologists, and you don't want to get those two confused. An entomologist is someone who studies bugs. An etymologist is someone who studies language. So I guess you could have an entomological etymologist who studied the language of bugs, but I'm talking about etymologists. So just etymology. There are etymologists who believe the origin of the word proskunuo is Persian. Comes from an ancient Middle Eastern custom of bowing down and showing honor or adoration to someone. It literally, in the ancient Middle Eastern languages, meant the idea of a reverent kiss. You ever heard kissing up to someone or kissing someone's feet? It comes from that idea. That proskunuo was this idea of an act of adoration. It came to mean, by the time of the first century, it came to mean the act of adoration through genuflection or prostration. That's another word you don't want to get confused. I had a friend, his name was Mark, and Mark always used to get prostrate and prostate confused. And he used to sing how angels' prostates would fall. I said, Mark, no, angels don't have prostates, and they don't fall. It's prostrate. Angels prostrate fall. And the word proskunuo is the idea of expressing adoration, expressing affection, expressing honor and respect through our attitude and through our act of genuflection, through our act of humility. And it was in proskunuo, that I believe the early church, and I believe we, find a shelter in the storm. We find refuge in the chaos of life, in bowing down and adoring and reverently kissing our Father in heaven. I believe that what the early church did when they devoted themselves to proskunuo, they did two things that we do today. That there are two ways that we experience prayer. And the first is individually. We experience prayer individually. And it's difficult for us to travel through time back to Jesus' day. It's hard for us to remember just how radical he was. He was a rebel of the highest order. Because all of the religious practice of his day, particularly in the people of God, in the people of Israel, in the Jewish community, was communal worship. Everything was tied to my relationship to the community. My identity as a Jew was related to my genealogy because I was a son or a daughter of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because I practiced a corporate religion, and approaching God was through the practices and through the priests. So that direct access to God was something that they couldn't comprehend. So when Jesus came along and he was saying that you have a relationship with my Father in heaven, that was so heretical, it was worthy of death. But he was saying what God wants is an intimate relationship with us, a personal, individual relationship. And he modeled that in his life. A handful of times in the stories of the Gospels, we read about, like we read in Luke chapter 5, that Jesus withdrew to the private places, to the lonely places, so that he could pray. Now that should confuse us. Because of all of the people, all of the human beings who have ever lived, Jesus is the only person who never had to pray. Because when he was praying, he was just talking to himself. So he didn't have to go off to pray, but he was modeling for us this practice of the individual intimacy with God. It's kind of the way he taught about it. In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 6, he talks about how there are people who are hypocrites, he calls them, who love to pray standing on the street corners and in the synagogues so they can be seen in their piety. He says they have their reward in full, but when you pray, you should go into your room and close your door and pray to the God who is unseen, and God who sees you there will reward you. He says, don't be babbling on like the pagans who think that God hears them because of the volume or because of the quantity of their words. He says, don't be like them. God already knows what you need before you ask. He says that prayer is this intimate experience with our Father in heaven. Don't make it more complicated than that. This is what I was trying to tell that team in Josh McDowell's office. That prayer is an intimate experience, a love relationship. And it's meant to be conversational. It's meant to be raw and natural. Modern psychology has told us that self-talk, that an internal monologue is a sign of psychological health. It is a healthy person who can have conversations, who can verbally process within themselves or to themselves those kinds of concerns or fears or doubts or anxieties or wishes and hopes and dreams, that writing them down, that verbalizing these things is a healthy psychological thing to do. That's what prayer is. Prayer is laying those things out, trusting that God is hearing. And the context of that can be anytime, anywhere. You have a long commute? I mean, by long, in Austin, I mean, it can be 2 miles that takes half an hour. But are you in your car by yourself at all during the day where you have an amount of time? You can pray. Turn off the radio and talk to God. People won't think you're crazy anymore. I mean, it used to be 20 years ago, if you're driving in your car talking to yourself, people went, oh, there's a nut job. But now, who knows? You could be talking to your aunt or your mother on the phone or hands-free television. I mean, so you can talk. Well, you pray. I had a friend in Dallas who had an extra large hot water heater put into his master bedroom because he loved to take long, hot showers. Because he was a family with 3 preschoolers, and he never got any alone time. And he said, Dave, my shower is my own alone time, and the shower is my best prayer time. And I'm like, TMI. No, I don't need to see that. But he was right. For many years, I would go out in the mornings and I would run. And I would run not just to stay in physical health. I ran to stay in mental health. Because going out and running 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 miles in the morning by myself was an opportunity for me to verbalize some of the things I was afraid of, some of the things I was frustrated with. I would regularly have arguments with board members at the church or members of the church who had disappointed me, or with my wife, or with my children, or with my friends, and many times with God. God's okay with that. Argue with him, drop an F-bomb on him, haggle with God. God can handle it. And prayer is that intimate sort of divesting ourselves of our burdens, our concerns. Confession is good for the soul. And this is the nature of prayer. It is individual and intimate, even when there are no words. Because sometimes there aren't words. Sometimes we are so broken. Sometimes we are so desperate. Sometimes we are so lost that there just aren't words. You know, prayer can be listening, just listening. Prayer can be reading. Prayer can read literature, read great poetry, read great information, great studies. These are ways for us to hear God. If you're listening for God, that's praying. Journaling is praying. Watching is praying. You ever thought that sitting on a beach watching the sunset is a prayerful time? Watching your children or your grandchildren play and the beauty of a young child is prayer. It's intensely spiritual. It's intensely intimate. Back in the 3rd century, a priest named Origen came up with a practice of prayer that became part of the church's liturgy in the 6th century. The Benedictine monks began practicing what they called Lectio Divina. It means divine reading. And Lectio Divina has 4 parts. And the first part is to read, and then to meditate on what you read, and then to pray, and then to contemplate. So that it's about listening, it's about verbalizing, it's about meditating, it's about contemplating. All of this is prayer. It's all good. It's all part of our experience with God. It's all part of the refuge that we find. Don't overthink it. Don't overcomplicate it. God says, I want you to be with me. Come on. Come sit in my lap. Come rest in my embrace. Experience me as an individual because you matter to me. And when we enter into that reflection, that contemplation, that verbalization, that's prayer. Don't limit it to certain liturgies or forms. That's prayer. I believe this is where the first church, on their first days, found refuge in the chaos of their culture. They found it in individual time with God. They practice prayer individually. So do we. Hasn't changed in 2,000 years. But they also practice prayer in community. Not just individually, but also in community. And this is where some of us have a real problem, because if individual prayer is mysterious and experiential and intimate, community prayer, public prayer, praying with groups of people is weird, awkward, boring. I mean, come on, let's be honest. When I take a knee and begin to pray, you're like, nap time. Time to check out. Oh, good. I need a break from listening for a minute, so I'll just close my eyes. Maybe I'll wake up halfway through the rest of the message. I mean, it's so hard to connect in a large group when someone else is praying. If you were raised in a liturgical tradition, if you were raised in a Catholic church or an Episcopalian church or Anglican church or even a Lutheran or a Methodist or a Presbyterian church that had a strict liturgy, where they had prescribed prayers like from the Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopalians, or many of the Catholic prayers, which are rote prayers, the language of which is beautiful and amazing, but tough to connect with. It's hard to say, well, those aren't my words. That's not what I'm feeling. I'm not really connecting, and you really have to work at it. I remember this is what turned me off to the church as a young boy. Even at 10 years of age, when we occasionally would find our way to a church, maybe Christmas or Easter, I remember sitting there and we were instructed as a congregation to read a prayer. And as a 10-year-old boy, I was like, those aren't my words. Who art thou art? I don't know who this is. And it didn't connect with me at all. It actually pushed me away from church for many years because of the insincerity of it. And the culture gives us no help with that because the culture encourages us to disdain the idea of praying together in public, of participating in intimacy with God as a community. In fact, it was on June 25th, 1962, that practice was outlawed in public. Engel versus Vitale, Supreme Court decision, 1962, where they said that the Establishment Clause of the Constitution prohibits the practice of prayer, no matter how generic, in public schools. In other words, I have grown up virtually my entire life with a public antagonism to prayer, with the idea that we can share intimacy with God together to be increasingly eroded. And I don't know if you've noticed it, but I've noticed it over the last handful of years in our culture that it is increasingly unpopular to say our thoughts and our prayers are with you. Remember how people used to say that? Even out of politeness. I had no illusions that the anchor man on the evening news was praying for whatever it was they saw. But they won't even say it now. They're embarrassed by the notion that I would publicly pray. They don't say our thoughts and prayers are with you. They just say our thoughts. You have our thoughts. And I'm convinced it's because they're embarrassed by the idea of a collective intimacy with God. But this is what the invitation is. The invitation is to find that collective voice. And even though our society is pushing back on it and eroding it, there's one way that prayer will always exist in our culture and in our community. That it will never be eliminated from our experience. The likelihood of fully eliminating prayer from our culture and from our community is the equivalent of eliminating electricity. We could never do it because you know the most common cultural expression of prayer that we have? It's called music. Because singing is prayer. I believe singing is the language of heaven. It's what angels do. It is the language of communicating. It is the language of adoration. And in our souls, the cry of our heart resonates with the musician, with the artist who verbalizes what we are feeling, our love, our despair, our anger, our frustration, our rebellion, our passion. It comes out in music. And music in our culture is our culture praying, seeking intimacy with God. And there's not one of us who lives without music. And it's what we do when we come together. We unite our voices in a song. I don't know what you experienced when Angie was just up here a few moments ago, but I experienced the presence of God in that moment. There's something that's been going on in the church, and it's not just this church, it's certainly here, but it's in churches all around America from the studies that we've seen and that I've read. It's that our culture is going through a seismic shift. Anyone who was born in the 21st century, anyone who was born after the year 2000, considers their experience in virtual community to be as valuable as their experience in actual biological or physical or demographic community. That if you ask anyone who's under 20 years old, they will tell you that the friendships and the relationships and the community that they establish digitally, online, at a distance, is as valuable to them as anybody who they are in physical proximity to. In fact, many of their physically proximity, the relationships they have, which they're in physical proximity to, are validated through the mechanism of the virtual community. And in that experience of an increasing ability to remotely experience community, this has become less valuable. This has become less significant. 200 years ago, this was the only place you could come to see everybody. This is where you reconnected after a week of work or after all of the things that had transpired. The church was the social hub. It was the relational hub. It was where all of your friends were. It was where you did life together. Now we do that remotely. If you add to that the alchemy of how busy the world is and how rapidly it's changing, and how difficult it is just to carve out time where we're not multitasking or remotely participating in something else, this becomes an increasingly rare commodity. If you're here today and you are a young family, God bless you. I don't know how you get here. I really don't. I don't know how you round up those little ankle biters in the morning and get them cleaned up enough to drop them off at church and get here on time. That is a miracle. Pretty much when I see a young family and they have their first kid, I just go, see you in 10 years. Because I understand how hard it is for you to get here. It is an act of worship for you to show up. Because there is one thing that is not portable. There is one thing that we do that is not transferable, and much of what we do is transferable, and I'm thankful for it. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I we did what we called the Hill Country Barbecue Tour. And we drove through the Hill Country sampling barbecue at places, little towns we had not had a chance to go to in the 30 years we've lived in Texas. And we wound up in San Saba, Texas. You know where San Saba is, out in the Hill Country? Beautiful little town, and we wound up in Harry's Boot Store. And I was shopping for Wranglers, because by the way, when you're in San Saba, you don't buy designer jeans. You buy Wranglers. And they had Wranglers on sale, so I was shopping for Wranglers. And as I'm shopping for Wranglers, this good-looking cowboy comes up to me, and he introduces himself. He says he's from Llano, Texas. He says, "Thank you, preacher." And I'm like, "Do I know you?" He goes, "No, I watch you every Sunday on TV." Do you realize, according to the metrics that we get, there are 8,000 to 10,000 other people connecting with Riverbend today who aren't here? And that's a good thing. I think that's something we can embrace. But there's something missing when we connect remotely with community. And that is prayer. That is worshiping God together. That is worshiping God together in a room full of friends and strangers. It is the power of our voices, singing together, worshiping together, proskenuo, falling at the feet of the Savior and lifting him up. There is a power in that that is not portable, that we only get it here. It is the power of worship. It is the power of music. I have a theory that says that one of the most influential worship leaders of our day, of my generation, is a guy named Bono. I remember a number of years ago, my wife and I were in Fort Worth at a Joshua Tree Tour concert in Fort Worth. And there were 14,000 other people there. And when Bono came onto the stage and U2 played their set, everyone in that room stood up and sang every word for 2 hours. It was one of the greatest worship experiences I have ever had. Because I was in a community whose voices were united, whose emotions were knit together. And it is the invitation of God who says, "Come together in community to experience me, and you will find refuge here. In the chaos of life, you will find shelter in community and individually." This is proskenuo. This is what the church was doing from the first day. From the very beginning, they found a refuge. They devoted themselves to these four things: to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to proskenuo, to prayer, to worship, to adoration of their God. I didn't realize how dangerous this was until 1988, when I sat in a room with 25 or 30 staffers from Campus Crusade, and I proceeded to tell them that prayer is intercourse with God. No one physically fell out of their chairs, but by the looks on their faces, and I'm not a mind reader, I was able to tell that this was not going over well. It was kind of a mix of a look of anger and shock and fear. It was as if I were killing kittens in front of them. And I, being the trained communicator that I am, and me being Dave, and you have to realize that I was not always the figure of piety that stands before you today. When I realized that this was not going well, I did what Dave does, and I doubled down. And I pressed into the metaphor. And I got to the point where I said, you realize that when we just look at prayer, when we watch other people pray, when we're voyeuristic in prayer, we're turning prayer into spiritual pornography. Exactly. And I didn't stop there. I kept going. And I said, we're so messed up in how we try to pray and impress people with our prayer. You know all it is? It's spiritual self-gratification. And I didn't use the word self-gratification. I used the technical term. I was never invited back to speak at Josh McDowell Ministries. In fact, Bill and his family left my church. But I wasn't wrong. My theology was sound. My homiletics and my pedagogy were terrible. But I was right. That intimacy with God, experiencing God in a one-on-one and in a community relationship, is the invitation of prayer. And that is a dangerous thing. Let's be dangerous. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.